The topic of a second American Civil War just keeps popping up online, in person, in the headlines, and on a lot of YouTube podcasts. And honestly, it's gotten very dull and kind of annoying if you ask me, because everyone keeps talking and acting that it's literally right around the corner, like America's about to collapse any day now, and that your average person could somehow and in some way beat the United States government in an actual civil war, which is not going to happen, by the way. And even if it did, it wouldn't work for a lot of very real reasons. Yes, we all know America is divided, of course. It's divided politically, culturally, and even socially. No one's denying that. The basic trust in our institutions is collapsing. The media has turned everything into a non-stop 24/7 culture war slop machine, and people are starting to see their neighbors as enemies. The 2024 election only made that even worse, with both sides questioning whether the system even works, which, to be fair, is a valid concern. But this conversation matters not because a second civil war is coming, it's just most of the people talking about a civil war don't actually understand what it would take for one to actually happen in a modern country, like the United States, for example, or why it would fail almost immediately. So the real question is this: if things are really this bad, why won't a second American Civil War happen? And why it wouldn't work even if it did? To answer that, we have to start with the single most important factor in any internal conflict, that being the military. Because no matter how angry people get, no civil war happens unless the armed forces fracture first. So the first major issue here is if we take a look historically at how civil wars emerge, one pattern appears consistently, that being fragmentation within the military and security services. In the American Civil War, roughly one-third of the United States Army officers resigned to join the Confederacy, providing leadership, logistics, and the command structure they actually needed. In Syria, after 2011, large scale defections within the armed forces allowed insurgent groups to gain territory, heavy weapons, and legitimacy. Without a military fracture, internal unrest rarely escalates into a full blown civil war. The other area here is that the modern United States military is structurally designed to prevent that outcome. It is a professional centralized force with no regional chains of command and no ideological sub-armies. Service members swear an oath to the Constitution, not to the political leaders, parties, or even movements, except for the National Guard in certain circumstances. Command authority flows through a unified federal structure reinforced by legal, institutional, and even cultural norms. In addition, the federal government maintains exclusive control over weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear arsenals, advanced missile systems, cyber warfare capabilities, satellite intelligence, and strategic logistics. These systems operate under a layered authorization protocol that no internal faction can access or even replicate. From an institutional perspective, the United States retains a near total monopoly on organized force. That's the structural reality, and it puts a very hard limit on what an internal conflict could actually look like. So, with what I just basically went over in regards to the military equation, the average American who owns firearms is in no way, shape, or form capable of going up against the modern US military, let alone the federal government itself, which, by the way, is who the military actually serves. Thinking otherwise is just very much so unrealistic. And I say that as someone who talks to a lot of people who love guns. And mind you guys, I like guns myself. However, I do understand the appeal, but I also understand the limitations. When the founding fathers actually wrote the Constitution, you have to remember the context. At that time, the average American citizen was on roughly equal footing with the government in terms of military technology. Everyone was using black powdered muskets. There was no real technological gap there. Now, fast forward to today, and that balance is completely gone. Your average American citizen is not even remotely on equal terms with the modern military, especially in an era of constant drone surveillance, advanced intelligence systems, and total air dominance. Now, I'm very fully aware that the United States military swears an oath to the Constitution, not individual politicians or even parties for that matter. But history has shown that this distinction becomes very, very blurry when states consolidate power or when institutions are tested under extreme pressure. Some people will immediately point to civil wars in so called second or even third world countries and basically say, look, their armies fought against the government. And while that can be true on the surface, it is often an illusion that a lot of people miss completely. In almost every one of those cases, there are elites, financiers, or power brokers, if you want to call them that, who are controlling the military factions from behind the scenes, even when the forces split off and fight each other. And that's what they don't actually tell you in history class. I know a lot of people who also like to bring up the most recent example of a modern military rebellion in a first world country, with what happened in Russia in the summer of 2023. What became known as the Wagner Rebellion, or as some people on the internet like to call it, the progression of heresy, as a perfect case study. Despite all that hype, at the time, the vast majority of the Russian military did not rebel against the state, which, let's be honest, is effectively run by Putin himself. And even though Wagner was a highly trained and well equipped mercenary force with real battlefield experience and fame or infamy, they failed to change the government or meaningfully alter the balance of power within Russia. I also don't see the United States military splitting off the way it did in 1861, in my personal opinion. There are simply far too many institutional, technological, and political safeguards in place for that not to happen. There's another point that people consistently overlook that I've actually noticed in these conversations, which is the issue of weapons of mass destruction. You have nuclear and chemical and even biological weapons that the military just cannot walk away from. Even hypothetically, if part of the military, let's say, did actually break off, do you people honestly believe no one would consider using those weapons to gain the upper hand? And even just beyond that, do you honestly think other nuclear armed countries would ever allow a full scale civil war in the United States to spiral out of control? The answer is obviously no, because the idea of WMDs falling into the hands of rogue militias or even splintered military factions would trigger immediate international panic and immediate intervention. That level of instability benefits no one, of course, and the global political elite know that all too well. And lastly, because I know already someone in the comments is going to bring this up, trust me. Let's say, for argument's sake, that the military somehow turned against the government, right? Do you guys seriously believe the political elites wouldn't respond with incentives, coercion, or alternative forces to protect their interests? I mean, governments have already used money, land, food, and even legal status as tools of loyalty. Everyone has a price. Whoever controls the resources controls the allegiances. That much is true. There's also nothing stopping a government, or rather any government, from relying on migrants or irregular forces to form a more privatized, politically loyal security apparatus rather than depending solely on a traditional military made up of its own citizens. History gives us plenty examples of this, guys. The late Roman Empire did exactly this by basically incorporating Germanic tribes into its own military structure. It didn't end well, by the way, but it did show how states adapt when loyalty becomes a concern. It's just something people should actually think about, in my honest opinion, when they go into discussions of talking about a civil war happening in America. Now, even if you set the military question aside for just a moment, there's another hard reality people don't like to be confronted with, and that's comfort. Civil wars generally don't just require anger, they require people willing to give up their entire way of life. And that's where this idea starts to collapse. The second major barrier to a civil war is economic interdependence and high material costs of sustained internal conflict. Historically, civil wars tend to occur in societies where large portions of the population already live in conditions of scarcity, informal economies, or substance level survival. In contrast, the modern United States operates on highly integrated national supply chains that connect food distribution, energy production, healthcare systems, digital finance, and employment across state lines. Approximately three-quarters of Americans rely on regular wage income to meet the basic needs, and most urban and even suburban populations depend on uninterrupted logistics for food, fuel, and medical supplies. Even brief disruptions, such as those seen during the COVID supply chain shocks, produced widespread panic despite minimal long term shortages. A true civil war would instantly collapse credit markets, destroy employment, disrupt utilities, and halt interest rate commerce. Historically, populations with significant economic dependencies on centralized systems tend to avoid large scale internal wars precisely because of the cost of participation is existential. So even if you remove the military from the equation here, the economic incentives still don't line up for a massive internal conflict. I also want to point out that I've already addressed this kind of topic before in one of my videos that I posted about 3 months ago about why a revolution won't happen, both in first world and most second world countries. You can check that out on my channel if you want more context. But let's be real here. Comfort is not something any American wants to lose. They just really don't. Ask your neighbor, and I'm serious, if they would like to live in the woods for a few months. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but most wouldn't even try it in the first place. Because honestly, we have way too many Americans who basically enjoy their football games, streaming services, and Amazon deliveries to even think about fighting one another over petty political differences or control of the government. So, yeah, it's just not happening. Now, I know some people like to argue that an economic collapse could trigger chaos for it to actually happen. And well, I would argue maybe in a way that could cause limited street fighting, but in my opinion, it wouldn't escalate to a revolution or even a full blown civil war. It would look honestly more like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, basically sporadic violence, isolated incidents, but nothing approaching a nationwide civil conflict. So, with that, I think most Americans are going to be more loyal to their paycheck than to any ideology. Unless they get both and are fine with how things are going, they wouldn't mind it at all. However, the political divisions do still exist. Sure, but at the end of the day, as long as people at least have some food on the table and their bills are actually paid, for the most part, the conflict is basically just performative. And by the way, with UBI coming in the picture soon, which is universal basic income for those who don't know, people are going to be even more dependent on the system itself, making any kind of rebellion or even a civil war even less likely than it already is. One must also look at the current grievances that everyone across the board has. And yet, nothing has escalated to an internal conflict that people imagine it would be. That's why I get more so annoyed with people on social media constantly claiming that a civil war is literally right around the corner, guys, not just in America, but also in Western Europe as well. Having spoken to many people who, mind you, actually lived through civil wars themselves in their own countries, I can absolutely tell you it's not something anyone should wish for to happen at all. Finally, there's an economic component here that a lot of people, for the most part, tend to overlook a lot. That being that the world is basically more so less tied to the US dollar, and there's just too much money being made in America for the elites to even willingly risk a civil war just to lose that monopoly. Now, if the US dollar does collapse, yeah, you might see some riots or maybe even more spikes in crime, though it's not just going to reach the scale of a civil war that people think it would. The incentives to maintain order are just way too strong, to say the least. And let's say, even if you do assume people are willing to make that sacrifice, you still hit the final wall. Division of itself is a problem on its own. Civil wars would require clear sides, clear territory, and perhaps clear lines. Modern America basically has none of that. So, the final structural obstacle is the absence of clear geographic, ideological, and ethnic or religious divisions capable of sustaining a civil war. In historical cases, such as the United States Civil War or the Yugoslav Wars, opposing factions controlled distinct territories, populations, and governing institutions. Modern America does not resemble this pattern. Political polarization does exist, but is geographically intermixed, with the urban centers leaning left while the rural areas leaning right, and the suburbs remaining highly contested and mixed. Every so called red state contains blue cities, and every blue state contains conservative regions. Demographically, ethnic, religious, and class identities are distributed across the country, rather than concentrated into separatist blocks. Federalism further complicates any potential split, as states rely heavily on federal funding, infrastructure, disaster relief, and regulatory systems. Without territorial coherence, shared identity, and economic independence, sustained internal warfare becomes logistically unworkable. Polarization today is real, but it is expressed primarily through digital platforms, media ecosystems, and electoral politics rather than physical control of land. And once geography drops out of the equation here, what you're left with isn't war, it's basically fragmentation. It still cracks me up that some people think an actual civil war would just be civilians versus the military and the political elites. Just to be clear with you all, America's far too divided in terms of its ethnicity, racial, and its religious makeup for a civil war to actually happen. As you can see, there would be far too many factions fighting for control. And it wouldn't end well, if we're being honest. And honestly, that perfectly sums up my earlier argument why weapons of mass destruction would be a huge issue. You have way too many factions with access to anything like that could easily trigger catastrophic outcomes, and the military or even other first world armies would likely have to step in just to stabilize the situation. Now, I know that a lot of online discourses are claiming a civil war is imminent, not just in America, but in Western Europe as well, is honestly just outright comical and frankly a little idiotic for my taste. And with all due respect, guys, I personally do enjoy listening to commentators like Tim Pool, Alex Jones, and even tech figures like Elon Musk. But when they say a civil war is right around the corner, guys, they're just so wrong in many ways. I think the Civil War topic highlights a larger problem. A lot of people can't separate the virtual reality from actual reality. So if you're one of those folks thinking a second American Civil War is about to happen, here's my advice. It is purely very simple. Please go outside, touch some grass, and take a look around. It's not happening. With that being said, let's talk about geography and ideology, because this is where people get tripped up on in regards to an armed conflict. I'm just gonna say it. Logistics, logistics, logistics is what allows any faction to actually operate and sustain a war, and more likely to win a conflict for that matter. So ask yourself this: which groups control most American cities? Now, which groups control most of the countryside? There you go. Conservatives dominate the rural areas, while the left dominates the urban centers. And let's say if a civil war mirrored the 1860s with a clear front line, in my opinion, the left would likely have the upper hand. Not because I want them to win, I don't, trust me, but because they have major global backers that the right simply wouldn't be able to have access nor have the backing to do so. On the other hand, the right has more military leaning groups and individuals, which could make them operationally independent and more resilient. But honestly, that alone wouldn't be enough to secure a victory. And remember, it wouldn't be clean cut anyways. You would end up with something like Syria, where there are countless factions, some with overlapping ideologies and some with opposing ones. And if history teaches us anything, especially from that conflict, the most extreme groups with the most extreme ideologies usually ends up dominating the rest. Keep that in mind. So, when it comes down to the reality of a second civil war happening in America, there is basically a 1% chance, while the other 99% means it simply won't happen. I get many internet pundits, not including myself, like to talk about a second civil war, not just in America, but in Western Europe too. Here's the thing: they're doing it for money, views, and clicks, if I'm going to be honest. Nothing new there. It is what it is. It's all about internet discourse and online debating, which, let's be honest, isn't going to change anything. And that's exactly the point of this video, to explain why it won't happen. Now, from my understanding, Europe does have a more ethnic unity in some places, but everything else I've mentioned still applies. That's why a civil war there is just very much so unlikely. But that doesn't mean America and Western Europe are currently stable either. What we're living through now is basically a slow grinding form of internal conflict. It plays out through institutions, the information space, like I mentioned earlier, and identity politics. Unfortunately, that's the reality of our time. Not to mention, the only way to deal with this is to accept it, and in some sense, observe it. Both America and Western Europe are decaying, and nothing's going to magically fix that. Your options are basically much so limited. Either you move to the countryside, the woods, or abroad to a more stable and free country. However you want to define that, it's up to you. And just to be clear, I'm not being a doomer or trying to be bleak here. I'm just giving the cold hard facts about this topic, plain and simple. If you, the viewer, have any problems with that, we can have a discussion in the comments below. Or you can let other YouTubers know and request them if they'd like to conduct a debate or a simple conversation on this topic. Oh, one more thing for those who have actually are and or have served in the military, it doesn't have to be in America, but it does actually help in this conversation. I want your guys' thoughts on this topic the most. Other than that, guys, keep an eye out for my next video, where I'll be diving into why America is in terminal decline, however you want to phrase it. And if you can, leave a like, a comment, and hit that subscribe button. I'd greatly appreciate it. Have a great day.